What is going on, everyone? Today I'm going to be giving you a full review for Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, and I really hate to say this. I really hate to say this, but it was just amazing. It was so damn good. So much to the point where even if you're not really a fan of Marvel, you should watch the first two Guardians films and then watch this one. Actually, you probably need to watch some of the Avengers movies too to fully understand what was happening, you know, because there's a big gap there with the Guardians and the Avengers movies. But regardless, this is one of those types of, you know, superhero franchises that I think anybody can love because there's so much relatableness about these characters. There's so much good humor and comedy, and there's great themes and characters, and this one worked just as much for me as the other two did. But as always, we're gonna get through the positives and then through the negatives, and then we'll give it a rating out of 10. This is gonna be fully non-spoiler. I'll do another video probably in the next few days, which will actually talk about more spoilers, and there's definitely a lot of spoiler things to talk about with this film, so we'll get to that. Starting off with the positives, it was incredibly dark and brutal, and there was even some bit of gore. Like, I was very surprised to see this. This is by far the closest to an R rating we've ever seen for the MCU. And I was shocked because obviously the MCU, you know, they've all been PG-13. They've usually kind of been a little bit chill. They don't show too much gore. You know, it's usually not that dark. There's definitely been some dark stuff, definitely, but it's never been that far. This is probably the farthest they've ever taken it. And I am so glad they were allowed to do that. It definitely didn't help them with the Rotten Tomatoes scores, because that's actually the reason why Rotten Tomatoes for the critic reviews have been a bit lower than usual. I don't think that's going to affect them. Obviously, the movie's still going to make a ton of money, but if you're wondering why the Rotten Tomatoes scores are a lot lower compared to the average Marvel film, that is because a lot of people were not happy with how R-rated this movie feels, even though it's a PG-13 film. I was fine with that. I love R-rated films. I would prefer all these movies to be R-rated, so I'm always gonna love stuff like that. But yeah, at the end of the day, it still was PG-13, so I wouldn't recommend taking your kids to see this. There's definitely a lot of imagery that might give them nightmares for at least a few weeks. But it's just something I wanted to see so badly because I feel like the MCU, we really haven't gotten many dark things in quite some time. I think Black Panther Wakanda Forever had some dark themes and elements to it. You could say No Way Home did as well, but you know, when you think of like Thor Love and Thunder, which had dark characters, but they didn't really take it seriously whatsoever, and then you go to Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania, again, dark things in it, but they don't ever take it seriously. Same thing to a degree with some of the other recent films, comic book films. But this one takes all that dark stuff very seriously, and this is a Guardians of the Galaxy movie. This is, by the very nature of it, a comedy. The first two were very big comedies. This one is still a comedy, but they do not forget to have the serious moments, and they mix it so damn well. James Gunn is just amazing at doing that. He did it well with the Suicide Squad as well, which is why I'm very excited for his DC films. I think he's going to do a great job there because he knows how to balance humor and seriousness so well. Because yes, there's a lot of comedy in this movie, but there's a lot of heartfelt moments. There's so many heartfelt moments. There's so many serious moments. There's so many scary moments, so many dark moments. That is how you do it. When it comes to emotion, this is without a doubt one of the most emotional Marvel films to date. And I'm not just saying MCU, I'm saying Marvel, period. Probably even comic book movie, period. Definitely brought a lot of tears to me. And most of those obviously came from the Rocket Raccoon backstory, which, yes, they do go into detail with his backstory. You saw that in the trailer, so it's not a spoiler, but his backstory stuff was probably some of my favorite stuff of the movie because it was really emotional and dark, and it added so much to the character. Obviously, we've kind of known about that backstory, but getting to see it is so much different. Getting to see how much more painful it was for him and who caused it, and the fact that that's the whole kind of point of this movie, it's the whole story, it just makes it all the more impactful. Like, Rocket is the main character of this movie completely. Obviously, it's still a Guardians film, but you could have called this Rocket Raccoon and it would have made complete sense. It really is his movie. To add on to that, the stakes are probably the highest we've had since Avengers Endgame. Like, at every moment, I'm thinking a character can die. every single moment. I'm not exaggerating. There's a couple moments where it was kind of ruined just because I've seen the trailers. So I was like, oh, well, they have to live because there's still some scenes I haven't seen them in yet that they were in the trailers with. But then I was thinking, oh, well, maybe they were deleted scenes. You know, I was trying to really justify the fact that, wait, is this character about to die? Because there's so many moments like that. It made the experience so much more intense, so much more emotional than it would have been if it was a movie where they just didn't rise the stakes whatsoever. But this one had it. This one did not take things as a joke. If it was going crazy, it was going crazy, and they were all aware of the fact that any of them can die at any moment. And that's the crazy thing too. It's not just like a couple of the characters. No, literally all of them I thought were expendable in this movie. Considering it's supposed to be the last Guardians film, they might do more, I don't know, but it seems like this is probably going to be the last Guardians film, and based on how it ends, I think it would make sense for it to be the last Guardians film. But none of them were safe for me. Like, I felt like any of them could die at any moment, and that usually does not happen in a Marvel film. The villain, his name is the High Evolutionary, is actually incredible. The actor who portrays him is so good. He's starting to become one of my all-time favorites in terms of comic book movie performances, because he also was amazing in Peacemaker, the series. And yeah, he's fantastic. He's probably one of the best villains in terms of the acting performance. In terms of the characterization, I don't think he's like that amazing, but in terms of his brutality and the performance, it's just outstanding. He's one of the most awful villains you will see in the MCU. He is so hateful. Like, there's really no redeemable qualities about him. Like, a lot of villains, they kind of make sense. They're like, oh, sometimes you're like, oh, he has a point. Like Thanos, right? Terrible person doing terrible things, but he kind of has a point with what he's saying, and you kind of understand where he's coming from, even if you're like, okay, he's still doing some crazy stuff that's god awful. This character, you can't sympathize with him whatsoever, which I kind of prefer that for this type of movie. Obviously, a character like Thanos is great as well, but this is even better sometimes because it just makes you hate the person so damn much, so you want them to defeat him so badly throughout this entire film. I've never wanted to see our main characters win more in any other film. The action is incredibly well directed. I was just amazed, especially this one scene. They do this really long one take, and I love one takes. I think they're amazing. I don't know if that's the right word for it, but I love scenes like that. James Wan is really great at that in Aquaman. A couple of the movies he's directed, he does really great stuff with that too. But James Gunn, I think he's done a couple things like that in Peacemaker. I think there's a couple scenes like that in the Suicide Squad as well, but I'm really excited to see more of those types of action scenes if he directs more stuff like that for his DC films like Superman Legacy, because that one take in that one scene, oh my god, it was so good. It was so well directed. Obviously, there's a ton of CGI, but the CGI is on point in this movie. Probably some of the best looking CGI from the entire MCU. So if you're worried about the CGI looking funky, trust me, that's not an issue in this movie whatsoever. I know a lot of people love to, nitpick things, but trust me, there may be just one or two shots you can find that don't look great, but the overall movie, the overall experience is pretty much almost perfect. Like I said, with the tone, they mix the comedy and the seriousness perfectly, and the comedy itself is really good. This is definitely the most I've laughed in a Marvel film in quite some time, and for that to be this movie, which is really dark, really depressing, really emotional, and for it still to be one of the funniest Marvel films, and that is such an impressive thing to do. It's just amazing how they're able to do that. I don't know how they're able to do that. Like, there was a scene, I was bawling my eyes out crying, and then a second later, I'm laughing hysterically. Like, that's really hard to make someone do that. But this movie pulled that off, and that is really impressive. The pacing was perfect. It's a really long movie. It's like 2.5 hours, but the pacing is amazing. Never was bored for a single second. I was glued to that screen for the entire runtime. Never looked away. Never checked my phone to see what time it was. I do that in a lot of movies. I check the time. I'm like, when's this gonna end? Didn't even check the time once because I was just so immersed into this story, into this universe, into these characters. Yeah, very impressive to be able to do that for me. And lastly, when it comes to the positives, Peter and Gamora, their story here, I absolutely loved. Gamora is a character that I think she's one of my favorite characters in the MCU, to be honest. And obviously when she was killed off, it was quite upsetting. But we have this new version of her, obviously a variant from another timeline. I guess not really a different universe, it's like a different timeline, which is kind of a different universe. It's kind of the same deal. It's a little weird why she's still there. Like, there's a lot of somewhat of plot holes involved in that. Like, shouldn't the TVA be trying to get after her? I'm sure there's explanations for it, but I just haven't really thought of it. But she's really interesting in this because she plays a very different role than she has in the other ones, obviously, because she's basically a new character. And she's basically the Nebula of the original Guardians of the Galaxy movies, like how Nebula acted in those first two. That's basically how she acts in this one, and Nebula acts more like Gamora did in those movies, which I think it's so cool how they kind of did a little switch with the characters there. But she was great, and she has a lot of great moments with Peter in this. I obviously won't spoil what happens with them, but I think what they did and how they handled their story was pretty much perfect. And as for the other characters, like I said, Rocket Raccoon shines the most out of any character in this film. Groot gets a lot of amazing moments. I actually really liked Groot in this movie, like a couple of surprising ones, to be honest. I think the only characters that were a bit lacking in this one compared to maybe Volume 2, maybe Mantis and Drax, but I still think there were a decent amount of good moments with them. Obviously, their moments were more comedic, but there's a couple of moments that I thought were really heartfelt between them, and it just kind of showed how good of friends they are. You saw a lot of them in the holiday specials, so if you really wanted to see more of them, go watch the holiday special. But at the end of the day, I do wish I saw a little bit more of them here, but they were still fantastic as always. And then of course you have Nebula, and yeah, she was great. She was just as great as she's been since the start, really. So I enjoyed all these characters. And then of course you had some new characters, of course the villains and such, which one of the characters is actually going to take me into the mixed section. This is a new section I have here. I don't know how many times I've done this, but we're going to talk about this character in the mixed, and that's Adam Warlock. Now, the reason he's going to be in the mixed and not in the negatives or the positives is because I don't really have a negative or positive opinion on him as a character. I liked him. I thought Will Poulter did a great job in the role, but I was surprised because I didn't really know who Adam Warlock was. I've never read any comics with him, and I thought he was going to be a much different character, and he is completely like 180, a different type of character than I was expecting in every way, shape, or form. He was so different. He was the complete opposite of what I was expecting, and I'm not going to say that's a bad thing. It's just, it was very jarring to see it because I was expecting such a different thing, but that's not even my biggest issue. I think my biggest issue is that he didn't really have a big enough purpose in this film. Like, he really didn't. You probably could have taken him out of this, and I don't think it would have made a huge difference. You probably could have replaced him with someone else, to be honest, and like they could have done the same things he does, and it really wouldn't have made a huge difference. I'm sure there's little things that, yeah, would have made a big difference, but in the end, I don't know. He didn't play that big of a role. He was cool. He was fun to watch. He was actually kind of funny in some of the scenes he was in, but I don't know, kind of just a mixed character for me. I don't know, he was nothing crazy. I don't know, he was just kind of there. But I like how he worked in with the High Evolutionary in his story and how he was connected to the High Evolutionary. But I don't know, he was all right. And then as for the negatives, the only negative I have, the only thing, which I can talk about this for hours, but it's only one thing. That's literally all I can say that's bad. The soundtrack. Now, here's the thing, right? And it's a two-part thing. So there's the licensed music, and then there's the original score. And the licensed music was definitely not as good as the first two, but it was still really good. The licensed songs, they were still solid. I just think the choices weren't as good as the first two, but it's really hard to beat those movies. That's like some of the best music I've ever heard in a movie ever, in the first two Guardians films. But even when it comes to the original score, I think the first two were still a lot better. And this was something I was actually worried about because I saw before going to see the film that they have a new composer for this movie. The composer for the first two was Tyler Bates, and he made some amazing music for those Guardians films. The main Guardians theme is one of my favorite main themes of any MCU film. And this third one has a new composer named John Murphy. And John Murphy was actually composing the music for the Suicide Squad with James Gunn for DC just a couple years ago, so it makes sense why he'd come over to here. But an issue I have with a lot of composers, it's a lot of composers to be honest, it's one of my least favorite things that composers like to do sometimes. A lot of times they won't respect the movies that came before them, and they'll just kind of completely make their own new soundtrack for a movie, even if it's a part of an existing franchise that already had a bunch of music. Now, I'm not saying he needs to just reuse music, but there's a lot of amazing themes and a lot of amazing pieces of music from those first two that should have been remixed or reused in this one. And as for like the main theme of the main Guardians theme, it plays maybe once or twice for like 5 seconds in this movie, and I was so disappointed to barely hear it in this movie because it's the main Guardians theme. How can't you play it, man? You gotta play that thing throughout the whole movie, and it plays like 2 times for like 2 seconds. Disappointing, man. Good music, he's a great composer, but it does not sound like the Guardians of the Galaxy music at all. It sounds like the Suicide Squad. It honestly, like, if you show me this movie, you don't tell me who the composer is, immediately I would think it's not the composer from the first 2 movies. And that's okay, it could feel different, I'm fine with that. But you have to pay respects to what came before. You have to. That's just how it works, in my opinion. It happened with the Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy. The first 2 movies had Danny Elfman doing the scores, but he did not continue with Spider-Man 3, and instead it was Christopher Young. But Christopher Young completely respected those first 2 Spider-Man films, and Spider-Man 3, a bunch of the music was remixed from the first 2 Spider-Man films. He kept that main theme in it very, frequently. This time, I didn't really feel that. You barely had any of returning themes, returning tracks, especially not the main Guardians theme. So that is my only negative, but that's really not a huge thing. It's just something that I kind of get nitpicky on because I love music and movies so much. So for a rating, I'm going to give this a 9.8 out of 10. I was going to go 9.9, but let's go 9.8. It's pretty close though. It's almost perfect. You're almost there. You're like 2.2 off. It's pretty close. I'm really debating if I liked it more than the first one or not. I definitely liked it more than the second one, but it's very close to the first one. That's one of my favorite movies, comic book movies ever. But this one, it definitely is close to that because it's a masterpiece. I'm so glad Marvel was able to go there with the darkness and the grittiness of it and just amazing colors of the movie. It's just so many things to love about it. Definitely go see it. I'm gonna do a spoiler talk review later on in a couple days. Definitely check that out. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Peace out, everyone.